Hello, I'm Adrian Finnegan, and this is Counting the Cost on Al Jazeera, your weekly look at the world of business and economics. This week, 2020, we pick through what could be the hot geopolitical and geo-economic topics of the year. From the most important election in the free world, will President Trump win another term? And what does that mean for trade wars and dispute? Can the world come together to tackle global warming and globalisation? And will we see more people on the streets amid concern that wealth is unequally spread across society? The International Monetary Fund's new managing director, Kristalina Georgieva, has described the global outlook as precarious. Trade tensions could cut global economic growth by 0.8% or $700 billion. Now, that's roughly the size of the Swiss economy. Central bankers have been pretty clear that any slowdown this year would require governments to step in with stimulus packages. Why? Well, because monetary policy, that is interest rates and quantitative easing, is at the limits of what can be achieved. And there are so many variables. The US election, a lack of leadership as the United States steps back on the world stage, and climate change. And if 2019 is anything to go by, we'll see more protests over austerity and the economic model that has led to wage growth stagnation over the last few decades. We've got together a panel of experts to cast an eye over the year ahead and to give us some insights as to what to expect. Joining us here in Doha, Akbar Khan, who's Senior Director of Asset Management at Al Rayyan Investment Bank, Jairo Lugo Kando, who's the Residence Professor at Northwestern University in Qatar and a Latin America analyst. And from London, joining us is Charles Hecker. Charles is a Senior Partner at Control Risks. Gentlemen, welcome to you all. Charles, let's begin with you. The US election, of course, is going to be keenly watched. That's an understatement. We've had a president that's shown little regard for liberal world order, attacking allies, the World Trade Organization. He's demanded the reshoring of industry. Whichever way you look at it, how is that going to change the way the world works in 2020?
Yeah, Adrian, you're absolutely right. People are going to be watching the U.S. campaign more closely than ever, and it's probably one of the more important presidential campaigns in recent memory. And before we even know the final candidate pairing, the very fact that there's a presidential campaign in the United States next year runs the risk of changing geopolitics a little bit. There are a few things that we're watching particularly carefully. Number one, of course, is the relationship between the United States and China. The U.S. economy is fragile and facing a bit of a slowdown, and you think that that might force the president's hand to sign some sort of at least preliminary trade deal with China. The risk there, though, is that the deal could be superficial and won't hold up to scrutiny. If the president doesn't sign a trade deal with China and the trade conflict escalates, that presents another set of both economic and political risk. The other thing that the president has to be careful about in the coming year is that everyone understands that during a campaign, the appetite for military conflict is incredibly low, and that may encourage some other actors to take action around the world and understand that the United States may not respond. So we're looking at North Korea. What if North Korea starts its missile testing program again and sort of pushes the geopolitical envelope a little bit, knowing that there's not that much the president may be able to do in a campaign season. Same thing in Iran. Perhaps Iran may consider some sort of tactical military activity in the Gulf, with the understanding that the United States will have its hands tied in terms of how strongly it can respond militarily during the campaign season.
Akbar, for most of 2019, there was tension in the Middle East. When isn't there? But it seemed to be much higher this year. It ratcheted up throughout the year. Then we had those attacks on the oil facilities in Saudi Arabia, and suddenly everything's much quieter.
So globally, when you have nations that have had disputes with each other, resolutions which are sustainable are generally those where the solution actually comes from the players involved. There are some cases where external help or arbitration can provide a solution, but those are generally the exceptions. So if the players involved in a dispute are the ones that are finding a resolution and are finding their way through whatever disputes they have, that's probably going to point to a more meaningful and more sustainable solution.
And are you talking about the Gulf crisis in particular here, with the blockading of Qatar, or are you talking about the
Gulf region in general?
Yeah,
You can talk about the Gulf crisis. You can talk about issues with Iran. So I think if the players in the region who have more to gain or lose, depending on which directions things go in, if they are the ones in control of the conversation, you probably have a more sustainable solution.
So they don't need Trump. I mean, to a certain extent, he's sidelined. He's out of their calculations.
I think no country can ever have the largest country and the most powerful country in the world out of their calculations. But I think if you're trying to negotiate and find a solution between your neighbors, it's probably helpful if you're talking to each other directly than through an intermediary.
And that's what's happening as far as the blockade of Qatar is concerned as well, in that there seems to be some sort of thaw. We had, of course, the Gulf Cup, the football tournament here in Qatar, and all of the blockading nations participated, and that seemed to go pretty well.
It did. I mean, since June 17, when the blockade began, that's probably the most significant step, where you had a final in Doha where Saudi and Bahrain were playing, and that's pretty newsworthy just by itself. So, clearly that's an interesting and positive development, but I think for there to be movement on the blockade, and we've had several false dawns before, I think all the countries which are against Qatar need to be united in seeking and wanting to move forward. So that's important. It doesn't seem to be the case at the moment.
Ira, the Trump administration threw its weight behind the opposition in Venezuela in 2019. What can we expect in 2020?
Well, first, that I think that things will continue the same for a while. So we can wait for a series of move in terms of negotiation rather than pushing for regime change. So I think that's going to take longer than the U.S. administration originally thought. In fact, the Economist Unit, Intelligence Unit changed its forecast from Maduro losing power to Maduro staying in power. And I think that's going to be true for the next few months at least. But I think Venezuela, in the context of Latin America, is, in terms of economics and politics, is rather irrelevant now. We're talking about the three major economies, which are Mexico, Brazil, and Argentina, are facing a very difficult challenge. First of all, those economies which failed in the past 10 years to reform, really, to restructure, really, are still very dependent on commodities. And in the face of a fragile international economy, this fragility is going to start showing up. The commodity price has not really moved, and in many cases, some of the key ones have fallen down. For example, copper, that affects a lot of Chile. Chile, on the other hand, which was the engine of growth for Latin America, is now facing huge economic political turmoils, which means that the forecast for growth of Chile is dire. So Latin America is in a crossroad at the moment. Argentina has a new left-wing president, Fernandez.
Right. So,
and Fernandez is going to have the room of maneuver that Nestor Kirchner had. There's nobody now like Chavez did in his time to buy the bonds from Chile. They from Argentina. They have huge debt, and they will probably have to go to the IMF again. And this is going to be very unpopular because that goes against all the promises he made to the campaign. In Brazil, Bolsonaro has failed to reduce significantly the deficit and is facing huge problems with the pension, and that's not moving either. And he's starting to see his base to erode. So there are big challenges ahead for Latin America.
Indeed, there are. You don't paint a very rosy picture.
No.
But, let's go back to London and Charles. In 2019, Charles, we saw street protests around the world. We were talking about what was happening in Chile and elsewhere in Latin America. It's hard to think of a time that there has been such universal outrage at the political classes over climate change, over inequality, over wealth distribution. How's that going to play out in 2020?
Yeah, you're absolutely right. I mean, I think you have to cast your mind probably all the way back to the 1960s to see a time when almost the entire world was convulsed with social unrest driven by sort of social and economic and political causes. And while all of the social unrest we've seen around the world this year has had different triggers, most of the underlying themes are exactly that. As you pointed out, it's climate change, it's income inequality, it's creeping authoritarianism around the world, all kinds of social and political challenges. For 2020, the risks are several. First, that this will continue and will worsen. And then we also think for companies, we think that there's a chance that there's going to be a certain amount of contagion and that these issues will move primarily out of the political arena. Most of these activities have been aimed at governments, but there is a risk in 2020 that this sort of social unrest and civil unrest will be aimed in the commercial sphere, and that companies are going to have to get on top of their games and ahead of the issues when it comes to slowing or acknowledging or dealing with climate control, or in, let's say, gender representation on boards of directors, or indeed in how they compensate their most senior executives and their most junior executives. Companies are being forced to take stances on issues like gun control. And so we think that there's a serious possibility that companies will become political actors in these spheres in 2020 as well.
That's fascinating. It sounds also expensive. Is that going to affect the bottom line? And how does that sort of change, if you like, in attitude, in direction, go down with shareholders?
Yeah, you're right. There's always a bit of a trade-off and calculations that ideally need to be made in advance about what the costs of understanding political trends and social trends are. I think I would argue that the costs of misunderstanding or misreading the social winds of 2020 will be much more expensive to companies than anticipating and getting ahead of events or getting ahead of protest movements.
Akbar, we've seen our fair share of protests, the wind of social change blowing through the Middle East in places like Lebanon and Iraq. What about the situation in Lebanon right now? There's a big deadline for the country coming up in March when it is expected to repay its debt. Is it going to miss that deadline?
That's a $1 billion question, actually, 1.2 billion to be precise. Yes, so clearly Lebanon has the ability to pay. The question is about the willingness. If you look at their gold and foreign exchange reserves, they are more than $45 billion. So clearly they do have resources. If you look at the value of all outstanding sovereign debt, not just the one that's maturing in March of this year, it's about $28 billion. Now, the interesting thing is there's been discussions about what their options are. Should they simply default? Should they do a haircut? Should they just pay as normal? 20 of that 28 billion is actually held by domestic banks, and it's held within the country. So you're not going to be hurting the foreign investor, you're going to be hurting yourself. So it would make a lot of sense for Lebanon to actually make the payments so that they don't inflict further damage on themselves. It's easy politically to say, oh, don't worry, let's not repay the foreigners. The problem is the banking sector, who owns a lot of that 20 billion, would have significant problems. And just generally, the last resort for a government is to default on sovereign debt. You do that and you're closed for capital markets for a long, long time. You make repayments, you then have leave the door open that at some time in the future, you may actually go back and tap the bond markets again and raise more money. But that door would be closed if they were to do a default. So from our perspective, it makes a lot of sense for them to make that repayment. They have the resources. Let's see what they do.
And Henry, you mentioned the new leader in Argentina. To what extent is there a similarity between Argentina and what's going on in Lebanon now? How will he balance the budget there? How will he deal with these calls, these street protests for an end to austerity?
Well, I don't think there's going to be an end of austerity, despite the rhetoric that he used during the campaign. I mean, no politician goes to the IMF for their own will. You know, it has a political cost. So when Macri, the previous president, went to IMF, he had delay for some of the reforms he had to do on an early stage, and he had to pay that. And it's going to be the same with Fernandez. The difference this time with the Peronismo in power, contrary to when Nestor Kirchner originally came to power, is that in that time, the Venezuelan government was very wealthy and they bought the bonds. So Argentina didn't have to go to the IMF. Argentina now will have to go to the IMF. The situation, their national accounts are very weak. They will have to go. And that is a very big challenge, because when you come to power promising that you're not going to do that, and then you end up doing that's going to be the big problem. Well, unless we see a big bailout from China, which I really doubt. I think the positive stories in Latin America is going to be in the near future Mexico, despite the rhetoric of the anti-U.S. rhetoric of the Mexican government. I think they're very near to sign a trade agreement, a renewed trade agreement with Canada and the United States, and that's going to be a huge impulse to Mexico. A lot of the business, I actually am very pessimistic with regards to the deal with China, and I think the United States, in that case, a lot of the companies are pushing the administration to sign the deal to Mexico and start moving some of the operations into Mexico in this case. So I think Mexico, in terms of my perspectives for the year 2020, has a more positive outlook. It will all depend on how much López Obrador managed to reconcile between his rhetoric and the reality of the economy. But more on the south in the continent, Brazil, Argentina, and others will have a much more difficult time next year.
I want to talk some more about China in just a moment. But first, Charles, let's turn our attention to the global economy. The risk of recession in 2020, is that off the table now, or are we expecting a slowdown?
Well, you know, for our political and economic forecasting, we work with a company called Oxford Economics, and Oxford tells us that the risks of a potential recession in 2020 are rising, but that is not the most likely scenario. And so far, we do not forecast a global economic recession. I mean, that said, global economic growth next year is going to be sort of in the 2.5% area, under 3% globally, and that is grindingly slow. 2019 was one of the slowest growth years since the start of the global financial crisis in 2008, and it looks like 2020 will not be much better. We forecast fairly slow growth in the Eurozone, fairly slow growth and dropping growth from 2019 in the United States. And so while recession is not yet on the table, it may be, getting its elbows ready to rest right there.
Akbar, to what extent will China be a drag on the global economy in 2020, or does that very much depend upon what happens in the trade war?
The trade war is clearly critical, but what's also important is China's ability to reflate, to stimulate their own economy. The resources that they have now available are more limited than previously. Several years ago, they spent a lot of money and did a fantastic job in not only stimulating their economy, but kickstarting some growth globally. Now they do have the ability, and they've been taking some measures in the last few months, particularly as the trade conflict has escalated. We would assume that would continue, perhaps not quite as powerfully, but also, as Charles was saying earlier, look, we have an election coming up in the US later this year. Politically, it would be expedient for the US equity market to be rising ahead of that. For that to happen, you need to have some positive outlook for the global economy, which would suggest that the trade dispute should be de-escalating. On that basis, if 2019 is when China bore the brunt of the slowdown, there should be, from a basis effect, some growth in 2020.
Do you agree with that? Is the trade war de-escalating? I mean, you look at how you were talking about how China is extending itself economically throughout the world right now.
Yeah, well, actually, in Latin America, they're actually retreating. And one of the reasons it's happening in Latin America is they burned their hands. In the case of Venezuela, they invested over $25 billion in over almost anything has been paid. And this was in exchange of oil, and the oil supply has decreased over the past few years. The only people that, for example, Venezuela is paying are the Russians, but not the Chinese. So they lost a lot of money. They're losing a lot of money in places like Venezuela. Brazil has started to reduce and limit the foreign investment from China in that country. Let's see what the new government in Argentina does. But what you can see is China is not as intense in terms of investment as it was or as it is, for example, in Africa. So I think in Latin America, they have less of a geopolitical investment and less of a return. And that's probably hitting back home. And I totally agree that they have less resources now to go into the spread of investment in all over the world trying to change geopolitics. I think the Chinese government's authorities on the ping have become more savvy, business savvy, so they're making investment less in political terms in the long run and more to get returns on the shorter term.
All right, one final question for the three of you here, and it's on monetary policy. Charles, are we seeing a limit to what monetary policy can and can't do? Will governments have to step in 2020 with fiscal policy?
Yeah, I think that's a problem on a couple of fronts. I mean, our view is that monetary policy has basically sort of run its course and may not be able to do what's expected of it in the coming year. That's one problem. The second problem is that in the event of a serious recession or in the event of any kind of serious economic shock in 2020, we're very concerned that there will be a lack of coordinated policy response around the world. I mean, we're looking at a period where politically and militarily multilateralism is under enormous pressure. And we think that that's probably also the case economically as well. And so in 2008, 2009, when you had fairly close and important policy coordination between the Federal Reserve and the Bank of England and the European Central Bank, Bank of Japan, for example, we're a little bit worried that in the event of serious economic problems in 2020, you're just not going to get that sort of policy alignment, whether it's monetary policy or fiscal policy. These multilateral solutions are going to be much, much harder to come by.
Akbar, would you agree with that?
Well, we've had $15 trillion worth of investment, if you like, or spending from central banks globally since the financial crisis began. And the result has effectively been a lost decade. So it hasn't really done a great deal, apart from a massive inflation of asset prices, which has led to inequality, which has led to political problems, which is, so we all see where that's actually ended up leading. It has got to the stage where you can only stretch a piece of string that far, and we do, and the central banks, and while the central banks have been working overtime in cutting, in easing monetary policy, it's allowed governments and politicians to basically be asleep at the wheel, not putting in the reforms that are needed, not making hard decisions about fiscal spending. You can only, I think the central banks, I do agree, I think the central banks have pretty much got to the end of where they can. If we need to somehow stimulate us out of this tepid growth, and this global economic slumber, then we're going to have to have some spending and, more importantly, some reforms. And that means we now have to worry about politicians, not central bankers.
OK. And who coordinates the politicians? I mean, the world we're living in at the moment, which is one of isolationism, if you like, moving away from globalisation. Is globalisation dead?
Well, I don't think it's dead, and the things tend to be cyclical. If you look at the long history of these things, I totally agree with my colleagues here of their views. I would think that, to me, more as from the political side, the big problem is the erosion of trust. There's so much in terms of tangible things that governments can do when they, for example, inject money or quantity easing to economies. But what really quantity easing does to the rest of society society generates trust, and that trust is simply not there anymore. And that is a really big problem and challenge for all governments to try to recover that trust from people. So even if we get another crisis and governments intervene massively, in my view, it will have little effect because people just don't trust. And if that trust is not there, that's the basis of economic growth and economic prosperity, the fact that people do trust. And that's the big challenge ahead.
Well, gentlemen, to use that old cliche, only time will tell. I wish you all a happy and prosperous and healthy New Year. Many thanks indeed for being with us. Akbar Khan, Jairo Lugo Ocanto, and Charles Hecker. And that's it for Counting the Cost for this week. If you'd like to comment on anything you've seen, you can get in touch with me. I'm at @Finnegan on Twitter. Use the hashtag AJCTC when you do, or you can drop us a line. Countingthecost@aljazeera.net is our address. And as always, there's plenty more for you online at aljazeera.com/CTC. That takes you straight to our page. And there you'll find individual reports, links, even entire episodes for you to catch up on. But that's it for this first edition of Counting the Cost of 2020. Thanks for being with us. I'm Adrian Finnegan from the whole team here in Doha. Bye for now. The news on Al Jazeera is next.